professor of 20th century U.S. history here at Dickinson College, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Jacqueline Jones tonight. Professor Jacqueline Jones is a social historian of the U.S. who has long examined and grown fields related to Southern history, African-American women's history, and labor history. She originally hails from our neighbor Delaware, where in 1970 she received her BA from the University of Delaware, before moving across the country to obtain her PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1976. She is currently the professor and chair of the History Department, Ellen C. Temple Chair in Women's History, and Maston Gentry White Professor of Southern History at the University of Texas, Austin. Professor Jones is the author of numerous publications related to 19th and 20th century U.S. history, women's history, and African American history, including Goddess of Anarchy, The Life and Times of Lucy Parsons, which was published in 2017 with Basic Books, A Dreadful Deceit, The Myth of Race from the Colonial Era to Obama's America, which was published in 2013, also with Basic Books, Saving Savannah, The City and the Civil War, 1854 to 1872, which was published with Penguin and Random House in 2009, and A Social History of the Laboring Classes from Colonial Times to the Present, which was published by Wiley in 1999. And then there's my personal favorite, the book that introduced me to Professor Jones, which is Labor of Love, Labor of Sorrow, Black Women, Work, and the Family from Slavery to the Present, which was originally published in 1985 and won the Bancroft Prize in 1986. Both A Dreadful Deceit and A Labor of Love were also shortlisted for Pulitzer Prizes. Professor Jones is also the recipient of numerous awards and prizes, including a MacArthur Fellowship between 1999 and 2004, a Ford Fellowship, and a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship. I should say that's a very abbreviated list of her awards. Tonight, Professor Jones will speak to us about ideas and research from her book, A Dreadful Deceit, discussing how although the word race is a normal part of our everyday vocabulary, the idea of race in America has a history. So please join me in welcoming Professor Jones.
Very nice introduction. And I want to thank everyone for the very warm welcome I've received here. It's been a pleasure to meet members of the book club that read A Dreadful Deceit. I want to give special thanks to Lindsay Barter for making the arrangements and inviting me here tonight. And everything has gone so well except the traffic from the train station to Carlisle, but I'm here, so it's really a pleasure. So I do want to begin by proposing that race is a myth. Race is a fiction. I want to say at the beginning, though, that the effects of the idea of race are very real, and we are living with them today. I also want to say that racial identities are real and based on a shared historical experience. But the idea of race as a way to separate and categorize the human race, race as a form of hierarchy with certain groups supposedly superior in intelligence or temperament or culture. Race is a myth. Race is a fiction. Race is really just another word for stereotyping. The idea that we can, as I said, make generalizations about large groups of people is an egregious form of stereotyping. So modern ideas of race have a history. Those ideas go way back. Today I'll be mentioning their origins in the 15th century when scientists and explorers were trying to classify plants, animals, and humans as well. So we can see this idea of trying to differentiate different groups as coming out of a particular historical moment. the Enlightenment, the beginning of a scientific revolution where scientists took great interest in the world around them and tried to create categories and explain plant life, animal life, and human life as well. What I want to do tonight, though, is explain these racial ideologies in American history and identify the specific purposes those ideologies served for specific groups of people in particular times and places. So here's the core, I think, of my talk, that race is not a transhistorical or primal or visceral feeling or idea. Race, as it is experienced, is very concrete. And the idea serves the interests of particular groups of people at particular times and places. So it's always critical, I think, for us to look at those times and places and ask a central question. Who benefits from these ideas of race, and how do they benefit? Not just slave owners. We might think right away, well, slave owners are an obvious group of people who benefit from this notion that a particular group of people is inferior in intelligence and temperament or so forth. But we'll see that the uses of race, the race as what I call a political strategy, those uses are not limited to slave owners, but we find them throughout our history. What I'm trying to do here is to complicate a word, or have us think about a word that we use all the time. And I know you're going to say it's folly for me to propose that we stop using the word race. It is certainly embedded in our culture. It's part of our normal and everyday discourse. That's not going to change, I can predict. But what I want us to do is to think more critically about the word and what it has signified throughout American history. So let me give you an example here, and you'll see where I'm going, I hope. So before the Civil War, textile industry grew up in the southern Piedmont. This is the area where the rivers come rushing down and can turn the water mills that fuel the looms in the factory. Well, this was a new industry in the South, and the owners of these textile mills looked around for the cheapest labor they could find. And they decided that the cheapest labor they could find consisted of enslaved people, men, women, and children. So the benefits of this particular workforce seem pretty obvious. Enslaved workers could not come in late. They couldn't come to work drunk. They couldn't quit work early. They couldn't quit. They couldn't complain about the long hours of work during the busy season. They couldn't go on strike. They could not demand village schools for their children. They might work carelessly and break machinery, but white workers were going to do that anyway. The enslaved women and children had experience on plantations weaving cloth. And if the owner of a mill could lease an enslaved workforce, that is just paid for part of the year, that would save him a lot of money because textile production was by definition a seasonal enterprise. It was dependent on those swift-running rivers and creeks in the early spring. So what we're talking about here is pretty much a cost-benefit analysis, right? That these mill owners kind of put pen to paper and figured out that when it came to finding a reliable workforce, one that couldn't give them much trouble, or not as much trouble as white people, that enslaved workers were going to fit the bill quite nicely. So we see throughout the Piedmont then, enslaved workers working in these looms in these very primitive textile factories before the Civil War. Now flash forward to the period after the war, the 1870s and 80s. Mill owners are seeking to expand production, and we find during this period a very strange thing happening. These mill owners are declaring that they will use only white people in their mills because people of African descent, they say, lack mechanical sense. Lacked mechanical sense. They argue that people of African descent couldn't run machinery. It was too complicated, it was too difficult, and as a result, they would be left out of this post-Civil War textile industry. Now, the grandfathers of these post-war textile mill owners obviously would have been quite surprised to hear that people of African descent lacked mechanical sense. But we see a racial ideology growing up during this period that somehow black people are not suited for factory work. They're not suited for working machines. And in fact, in the South, until well into the 1970s, African Americans did not work in textile mills, they did not work in factories, and they did not even drive tractors on plantations that much. So strong was this notion that mechanical work was work for white people. So we find here kind of a circular reasoning at work. If you exclude a particular group from a particular kind of work, then the idea is reinforced that somehow they aren't suited for it or they aren't able to do it. The reasons why black people were excluded from textile factory work during this period are quite obvious, and they have nothing to do with race as a biological indicator or signifier, nothing to do with color of skin. These decisions had to do with politics, with political power. So why were African Americans kept out of Southern textile work when they had been so prominent in that work during the antebellum period? White politicians in the late 19th century decided that they wanted to provide textile work for whites only as a form of privilege. Now, it's hard for us to imagine working in a textile mill as a form of privilege. This was hard work, the hours were long, brown lung was common, getting the fibers in your lungs. Children were put to work at an early age, laboring very long hours for long pay. It's a legitimate question. Why is this work limited to whites as a sign of their privilege? Well, the alternative for most whites was to remain on the countryside as tenants or sharecroppers. They were landless for the most part. Schools were few and far between for their children. At least the textile mill village had churches, schools, a degree of sociability that was lacking in these isolated plantations throughout the South. So many whites jumped at the chance to go into these small mill villages, make some cash, not just promises they would have gotten at the end of the year if they had been sharecroppers, but to make a little cash, to send their kids to school, to have a church nearby, and to enjoy this family sensibility that bound white people together in these mill villages. Furthermore, politicians hope to forestall any interracial coalitions that might have arisen during this period. This is an era of great discontent in rural areas. These landless folks are banding into the Populist Party and other agrarian organizations. And there is even the suggestion, and in some places on the ground, the reality of black and white sharecroppers and tenants coming together to challenge a very exploitative system of sharecropping tenancy and so forth. So by drawing whites out of off the countryside into these mill villages, leaving black people behind to do this very arduous work in the fields, white politicians hoped, as I said, to counter any kind of movement toward interracial coalitions. So we see there were real purposes to excluding black people from these textile villages after the war. What is interesting is that that political motivation got subsumed under a racial ideology. The ideology that black people lacked a mechanical sense. And again, what is that notion? That's a stereotype, right? That you're making these gross generalizations about a whole group of people. But the point is that that notion benefited white politicians who didn't want to have to deal with this insurgency of populists and other coalitions of blacks and whites on the countryside. And this ideology also benefited white sharecropping families who had a chance to move off the land and into these villages and make some money in the process. So what I've done here is, with this first example, is to suggest that racial ideologies they're not consistent, they're not fixed in stone, they change over time, and they usually have a particular purpose. And that purpose is to benefit one group or another. So these ideas about impermeable differences among the races can be used for a variety of purposes. They can be used to justify a discriminatory social division of labor, one that benefits specific groups of people, white sharecroppers and white politicians. These ideas about difference, as we'll see, have served other purposes throughout U.S. history as well. And again, we have to pay attention to place and time. These are not universal ideas. They develop in response to particular social relations, power relations. So I want to go back a little bit to this age of exploration and the early American colonies. Let's look at the Chesapeake colonies in the 17th century. What's interesting then is that plantation owners, tobacco owners, used a variety of kinds of workers to pick tobacco. They used indentured servants, who were young white men and women from England. They used a few enslaved people of African descent. They used their own wives and children to a certain extent in the fields. In some instances, they hired Native Americans who were close by, or especially women and children. And sometimes they hired free white people to work in the fields for a limited amount of time. My point here is that there is a wide variety of kinds of workers at work in the tobacco fields, and these tobacco planters tended to generalize about the unfree workers they lorded over. And by unfree, I mean enslaved people, but also indentured servants. So the idea about these bound workers, as they were called, these unfree workers, was that they were all the same. They were all resistant to discipline, they were irreligious, they were promiscuous, they were potentially violent because of the nature of their work status, because they were landless, they were had no freedom, they were bound to do what the owner said they had to do. So we see this within a world of colliding empires in the 17th century, with the European countries vying with each other for land, for labor. And within this Atlantic world, this world of colliding empires, we see a wide variety of skin colors, a wide spectrum of people who are meeting on the high seas, meeting in the colonies of different skin colors. And during this period, there are not particular characteristics attached to a particular skin color. Because as I said, this is a very fluid situation, and we see no firm ideas about race playing a role in this Chesapeake world, at least at this point. Now, scientists back in Europe are experimenting with the idea of race, but those ideas have not trickled down to ordinary people. And they're living their lives, and they're trying to get by as best they can without the superstructure of race in their heads. So race here, again, is not the operative notion. Power is what is at work in this context. We might say, well, the usual reason for enslaving people of African descent was that they were non-English, they were not white, they didn't speak English, they were not Christian. Well, the same could be said of Native Americans in the Chesapeake as well. Darker skin color, non-Christian, non-English speaking, non-white. Why then weren't Native Americans enslaved to a great degree? Well, primarily I would argue because Native Americans met the English colonists as warriors, as diplomats. These are groups that formed confederations. They were very powerful. If you look at early images of some of these Chesapeake Native Americans, they're holding guns or bows and arrows. They are a force to be reckoned with, and many English colonists dealt with them as they would a foreign nation, with the full range of diplomatic respect accorded Native Americans. Africans in this system were uniquely vulnerable because they were many thousands of miles from their home, and they had no nation state that could redeem them on the high seas or protect them once they had been enslaved in the New World. So again, we're talking about power relations here, why people of African descent might have been enslaved. It was not because explorers or slave traders thought that they were of a different race, but that they were uniquely powerless in this situation. By 1700, the slave trade had picked up because the English and others had invested in it as a money-making venture. And gradually, Southern planters used enslaved people exclusively as laborers. Gone was this kind of kaleidoscope field workers before, with Native Americans, indentured servants, family members, and so forth. But slavery, as it evolved, was not a racial system. It was a legal system. a legal system. And this is why. Because it is true that the original slaves were of African descent, most of them at least. It took only a generation or so before white owners began abusing enslaved women. And their offspring were also enslaved, regardless of what they looked like. So if a child has a white parent and a parent of African descent, we call that child black, but legally also that child was enslaved. So it's interesting that in the antebellum period there were visitors to southern plantations who marveled about the fair-skinned, blue-eyed, brown-haired children on the plantation who were enslaved. These, of course, are the children of rape, of abuse. So do we call them Africans? Do we call them children of the black race? Well, it's hard to when they don't look anything like people of African descent in at least a superficial physical way. But my point here is that slavery is a legal system. The slave takes his or her status from the status of the mother. The physical appearance is irrelevant. Physical appearance is irrelevant. And that's why I think we should realize that slavery was a legal system based in law and not necessarily based in race. So moving through time here, we come up to the American Revolution, and we find one individual who is trying to justify and rationalize the enslavement of so many people in this revolutionary world where liberty and freedom are the watchwords. That person who agonized over this, of course, was Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson felt the need, I think, to explain why a large percentage of the Southern population, enslaved people, were not going to be part of the body politic. All men are created equal, he said. So why this invidious distinction between two groups? Well, Jefferson thought that as a good scientist, he should do some observations and record his observations. And in a book called Notes on the State of Virginia, he made some tentative generalizations about people of the black race. He said, for instance, that they were naturally less intelligent than whites. They were naturally less capable of doing math or writing poetry compared to whites. They needed less sleep than white people. They didn't mourn the loss of family ties the way white people did. And we know, of course, who was he basing his observations on? What is his own enslaved workers in Monticello? Didn't need as much sleep. They were roused at dawn and worked until dusk. Couldn't write poetry or do math. They were kept illiterate their whole lives. Didn't mourn the loss of family ties. Is that what he thought when families were separated because he wanted to sell a group of people and make some money by doing that? In other words, now we can see his generalizations were based on a very particular population that he was exploiting. But he's trying desperately to provide some rationalization for the whole system of slavery. Going further into the antebellum period, we find slaveholders feeling very much under attack by northern abolitionists who were claiming slavery is an evil in the sight of God, this is an immoral system. Southern slaveholders in the 1830s and 40s came up with the idea, oh no, this is not This is not an immoral system because our enslaved workers are naturally childlike. They're naturally dependent. Slavery is a school for civilizing otherwise uncivilized individuals. So this notion of the enslaved person as childlike is part of the slaveholders' ideology, part of their justification. We're doing these people a favor. This is a benevolent, this is a benign institution because they cannot take care of themselves. What's interesting is that during the Civil War, that whole ideology recedes, and as enslaved people rush to Union lines, help Union soldiers as scouts, as enslaved men join the Union Army, as they serve as spies for the federal forces, Southern slaveholders begin to change their tune. Suddenly, these folks are no longer so childlike and dependent. Instead, they're now very cunning, and they're treacherous, and they're naturally violent and naturally threatening to their owners. So that was just within a few years. We find, again, these words naturally as in racial distinctions, right? But these shifting perceptions are quite noticeable. The North was not immune to its own form of racial ideologies. By 1800, most enslaved people in New England had been freed, but they were mostly poor. They had been freed, but without anything really in the way of land, material possessions, cash. They had no access to credit. And even skilled tradesmen gradually lost their jobs to whites, meaning during this time that the formerly enslaved population was an impoverished population. Meanwhile, many white workers were going through a process called de-skilling. Skilled shoemakers were losing their jobs to factories. They were filled with anxiety and resentment. Added to this was an influx of newcomers in New England in the 1830s and 40s, the Irish in great numbers. All of this led to the emergence of particular New England racial ideologies. The idea was, and this shows you how contradictory these ideas can be. Formerly enslaved people, people of color, should be kept in menial positions because otherwise they will threaten whites and compete with whites in the job market. There's that notion. But also this idea that black people are naturally poor and dependent, and they're going to be a charge on the public till. Taxpayers are going to have to pay to keep them going. What we're seeing here is a certain dynamic of prejudice take hold, and it became particularly virulent when the competition was over jobs or schooling, with schooling in particular representing training for citizenship, and white people holding desperately onto the public schools as their privilege, as citizens or citizens in the making. A Connecticut state legislator put these contradictory ideas into one sentence in 1831, and he was referring to the effort by a group of black community members to create a school in Canterbury, Connecticut. He said, "The colored people can never rise from their menial condition in our country." And by that he meant they're incapable of rising, they're only suited for menial jobs. But then in the next phrase he said, but they ought not to rise here. If they can't rise, why the effort to keep them from rising? And that's the nature of this contradictory racial ideology of New England. Black people simultaneously poor, dependent, but also predators, and hoping to get whites' jobs as soon as they can. It's a great sentence. The colored people can never rise from their menial condition in our country. They ought not to rise here. Around the same time, an abolitionist, I thought, had a particular insight into the nature of prejudice. He said, this is James Freeman Clark, he said, of black people, we dislike them because we are unjust to them. We dislike them because we are unjust to them. In other words, the injustice comes first, right? The exploitation of a vulnerable group of people. And then that takes on a life of its own. It seems natural, right? It seems set in stone. And as a result, the prejudice is compounded, the disdain is compounded. The laws are in place to keep a group of people down. So I just wanted to say a few words about terms we commonly use and that we see in the newspaper all the time. These are terms that we're very familiar with. One is racial difference. And I'll give you a couple of examples from articles in the New York Times. One purported to show that black people as a race suffer from tuberculosis more than white people as a race. Well, if you looked at the statistics provided in the article, you could see tuberculosis is a poor person's disease. And if a disproportionate number of people in a particular group are poor, then they're going to suffer from tuberculosis more than another group. This is not a racial difference, it's a class difference. But because it contrasts blacks and whites, it gets translated into a racial issue. Another example from the New York Times was a so-called racial differential in sleep patterns, finding that black people got a good night's sleep less often than white people did. If you read the study, you saw that almost everybody, almost all the black population surveyed lived in cities, and almost all the whites lived in suburbs. We might say one area much noisier than the other. This is a matter of place, right? It's not a matter of race. But it shows you how these words have kind of affected our vocabularies and they distort the reality at hand. One other, and this is one of my favorite terms to disparage, and that is race relations. Race relations. That term has a history. It emerged in the 1920s in what were called interracial councils in southern cities. The idea was that if men and women of both races, men and women of goodwill, could sit down and share a meal together, they could solve the race problem. They could work to improve race relations. Well, in these southern cities, African Americans were denied basic city services. Their children attended poorly financed, segregated schools. The men and women were relegated to menial jobs, never able to aspire to professional occupations. Sitting down and sharing a meal together, this effort in race relations was never going to solve the structural aspects of these problems in the South. When you hear the term race relations, you have to say, what is the context for the encounters? Is it a matter of race relations when an enslaved woman burns the biscuits because she knows her mistress is having a fancy dinner party that night and she wants to undermine the mistress's pride in the meal? That's not race relations, that's owner-slave relations, that's labor relations. When a sharecropper resists the owner of the land, black sharecropper, white landowner, is that race relations? No, that's landowner-tenant or sharecropper relations. When you hear the term, ask yourself, who are the groups relating to one another, and what is the context? So I'd just like to end by suggesting that because racial ideologies have had such a destructive effect in this country, in most of the United States today at least, we are our zip codes. The long history of housing discrimination is a reminder of the pernicious legacies of race embedded in the very structure of society. Cities have sponsored or created ghettos to segregate black populations. The federal government supported banks in their redlining practices and later in their predatory lending practices against black communities. The federal government created public housing projects that were segregated and unlivable, adding to segregation. This is not because black people were a race, but because they were uniquely vulnerable. Remember that the Southern black population had virtually no representation in Congress until the 1970s. When a group is not the constituency of a political party, it is bound to be exploited, to face discrimination. Even when discrimination was finally outlawed officially with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, structural inequalities remained in the social division of labor, in the patterns of work among people of color, in residential segregation. Remember that today, where you live often determines the quality of the public schools your kids go to. Where you live decides or defines the nature of the police protection and fire protection. Where you live is often a function of the job you have and whether you have medical health insurance associated with that job. So housing segregation is really one of the most insidious legacies of these racial ideologies. It is not the only one, but it is certainly a pervasive and pernicious factor in American life today. I think then finally that when we use the word race, we tend to reify it. We tend to, whether we know it or not, give credence to this idea that you can divide the human population into 5 races, or 20 races, or 30 races, which we know is nonsense today. I know we can't expect everyone to dispense with the word race anytime soon, but we should understand the historical uses of the idea, who benefited, how, where, and to what end, in order to challenge our long-standing use of the word and to think seriously about the various forms of its destructive power over the centuries. Thank you.